Cosmic here, and welcome back to another Legends of Runeterra video. Today we're going to do something a little bit different, and hopefully by the end of this video, you will never have to watch another meta video for as long as you play the game. That might sound extreme, but it's quite literally how meta lists are put together, the different kind of science behind it as it were, and kind of the pros and cons of Mobalytics data. So with that said, a couple things up front. Yes, I am a Mobalytics partner, but in no ways is this sponsored or anything like that. This is just me creating content and talking about something because I am a data analyst by day, so I like talking about numbers and all that good stuff. So this is really going to be more educational and informational, as it were, than saying, you know, here's a new decks to be playing. So that's one of those things to mention up front. And then the second one being that, yes, if you watch the past video, this is a biased sample. And what I mean by that is generally people who are using the deck tracker are going to skew. They're going to skew higher on the ladder, right? They're going to have a similar mindset in terms of what they're looking to do and the kind of matches that they want to be playing. So inherently, this data does have some bias to it, and it's not perfect, but at least with the information that we have available and what we can glean from it, there is still useful information that you can get out of this and will make you a better player at the end of the day. Now, there are other deck tracker sites and what have you. Ultimately, it's going to come down to, how many games are they tracking? And what I mean by that is on this right-hand side here, you can see is matches. And that it has a more statistical relevance to that. And what I mean by, if something has a 70% win rate, but it has a sample of only 10 matches, well, that doesn't really mean anything, right? Once you pass a certain threshold, you can compare two different lists side by side. You can look at the win rate. There's stat calculators online for this and say, okay, I have one deck list that has a 59% win rate and another one that has a 57% win rate. Are these all that different? Yes or no? And right, and then you can plug that in and find those types of answers and decide for yourself, is this meaningful? Is it good? And what does that mean from an overall meta perspective? So with that, we are going to be going through the site overall. Again, high level, how is a meta list kind of formed? I know Swim does this in his videos, and I'm pretty sure he's talked about it in the past, so that information's already there. But going a step beyond that and understanding, okay, let's say a new patch just dropped. Obviously, you can go watch a Swim, BBG, Mogwai, whoever else that's like a bigger name making meta content video and whatnot. But that might not always have all the information available, right? It doesn't always tell you, okay, well, a lot of people are playing, let's say, for example, Noxus and Shadow Isles. At the time of recording this, it's the most played list. But what if I want to counter that? What does that look like? What other lists or cards should I be looking at so that I know if I'm seeing a lot of this that I can swap to it, right? If we think back, and I use this example all the time because it's just an easy one. We think back to when Swim made the meta, the Rally Elusives list. It had like a 90-10, or I should say 10-90 matchup against Spider Draven, meaning that you basically lost every single time, or should lose about every single time. Obviously, variance being what it may, but it was a direct counter to that list because they just did nothing for the first 3 turns. So that's kind of the direction that I want to be taking this. And then again, hopefully by the end of it, you do have kind of a, your own take on this and how you can make your own meta list and understand, how do I counter certain decks? So from a high level, we are going to start at like the top level of the site just for like overall navigation and like things that people might miss. And then we'll actually go into the different region breakdowns and talk about why these are important and kind of some pitfalls, as it were. The last disclaimer, because I'm just remembering it at the time of recording this, don't always take, especially for the lower sample size ones, as gospel. When I hit Masters this season, I noticed that the deck tracker on your profile, so for mine it was like, let's just say 40 wins, 10 losses is what was reported, but I actually had like 45 and like 12 losses, right? So it didn't have every game, but it had the vast majority of my games in ranked ladder. But again, this is where the sample size really comes into play, or again, number of matches, that if it is a lower count, that you just need to just take it with a massive grain of salt and or just ignore it. So intro rants aside, let's say you've never been to Mobalytics, right? Let's say that you have never visited the site. Make sure you're in the Legends of Runeterra section, and then on the left-hand side here, you're going to be looking for the meta stats. Obviously, meta tier list, this gets updated weekly by Swim and anyone else that's helping him with it at the time, but this is a very static image, right? So you might ask, why is this important? Why do I care, right? Meta tier list will always be, here's one day at this one time, here's what we saw for the past week, here's kind of how it's going to shape. Now, you'll notice that up here in the top right corner, it says number of games and last updated 21 hours ago. So based on, and I think his name was Fiz in the Mobalytics Discord, he informed me that this data is reset every 2 weeks and it lines up with the patch, right? So at the time of recording this, we have 1.6 dropping next week. If you want to look at this from a meta perspective and kind of see what are the trends been over the past week, generally you want to try to look at it Monday because that's when you're going to have your most sample size, depending on when they get that last update in. Going forward, what that means is if you're coming up on a weekend, right? If you are saying, okay, well, it's a new season, new ranking, all that stuff, you probably want to be checking this daily and seeing what people are playing, because otherwise it's as close as to real time as we're going to get, right? This will continue to update. Another thing that's important to note for those that are, below Masters, there is also an option to toggle here where you can go look at below Masters matches, or if you want to look at just the Masters meta, see what people are playing, and again, maybe search by matches, because this is going to be the percentage of decks that are being played. Then you can realize you're going to see a very different style of meta. And I'm actually really surprised now that I'm again doing this in real time. Really shocked to see Freljord Noxus as the most played, and by a good amount, no less. Wow. And okay, that's actually pretty impressive. So sure, this is a good example. So we're going to use Freljord Noxus then. So let's go back. Let's make sure that we are looking at all ranks data. So again, we'll sort this, and you'll notice that it does drop off quite a bit. But this one is going to be an interesting case. This is going to be, every part of this is going to have good parts and bad parts. I'm hopefully going to elaborate that on this well enough as we're going through it so that you know when these pitfalls are possible and when to avoid them. The negative with Freljord Noxus is that it encounters, I can just scroll down. If you look down here, it's counting Braum Swain. It's counting the Noxus Allegiance variant of it, and it's also counting Sejuani Ashe, which are really 3 different decks at the end of the day. Yes, you can argue that there's some overlap between Braum, Swain, and Ashe Sejuani. They have some nuances to them, which I think that they're not exactly, to be lumped in the same as it were. But at all this data gets combined where it treats these 3 decks the same. The good part, I'll show another example of this in a second, but let's assume that we only have one deck that's kind of in this outlier. What's nice is then you can go look here and say, okay, well, what are the worst matchups, right? And we can tell by looking at this, I guess that's a really good example otherwise, Freljord in Ionia. At the time of recording this, it's going to be mostly a Kinku Elusives type of list. So again, what's nice is if you click in this, it'll then take you to Freljord Ionia. You can see the most played cards. And then perhaps not surprising. Okay, that one is surprising. Only 196 matches, right? But this is where you got to take the sample size into consideration. Okay, 1,700 matches, which is way larger than any of the rest of these. Let's click into this. Okay, so this is a list that has a positive matchup against the Freljord Noxus variants. And we know that, at least from for the Noxus standpoint, from the aggressive strategies, we know that Will of Ionia and Concussive Palm can be really good against it. And then obviously with the more mid-range matchups, Will of Ionia just gets better and better, because if you bounce like a Sejuani, or I guess that's not the best example because they as on-play effect, but let's say you bounce a 6 or 7 cost card that goes back to their hand that doesn't have an on-play effect, they just did nothing for that entire turn. And because it only costs 4 in the way spell mana works, you still are able to develop your plan. And quite honestly, Sejuani is like a fine card to bounce most of the time if it means one of your elusive units is going to stay alive and or you're preventing lethal from happening. So not the best example, but at least a decent one. So here we are, Ionia Freljord. It's a nice starter list. Now, again, that's the bad with the good. Now let's go back to the bad. The bad part about this is, at least as far as I can tell, other than just by pure matches, right? This will always just give you whatever people are spamming the most, which in my opinion isn't always the best representation of, I am looking for a Ionia Freljord deck. What is the #1 list I should play? Yes, this one's pretty good, but I would always caution that if you are playing in whatever rank you're in the ladder, right? Make sure you have some changes to the list that reflect what you're going against, right? So, for example, Highwayman here, we don't really have any other good value for this. This is in the deck because it is a card that can help stop aggro decks early on, right? You get 2 blockers out of it, which is really, really nice. So, with that said, if you're looking for, a card to swap this out with, maybe you're going higher into more of the spells here, or I guess they have 3 of the rest of the other ones. You'd probably take this out for something else, is the general point. Maybe even a jeweled protector if you want. And right, that's where the data that's provided can only go so far. So some of this is still going to come down to a meta knowledge, but hopefully you can at least get to this point and understand what the larger meta looks like and what does that mean in terms of what list should I play today and what are good and bad matchups. Now, I mentioned it gives you this one list, but then don't forget you can go back and then you can click on another variant and there you go. So here's an example where it has Jeweled Protector. I personally love this card. A lot of people disagree with me on it, but this goes back to like preview patches. I just think it's a fantastic card. Here's another version of it, right? So it's still that same core mechanic or I shouldn't say mechanic, but archetype that's very good against the decks that we were just talking about, right? And any of those like slower mid-range Ash, or I should just say Freljord Noxus lists. And it gives you an idea of, okay, so if I'm seeing a lot of the Freljord Noxus, what do I want to counter it with? And then you swap it in this deck. And then, of course, and again, I'm treating this as if people are, completely new to Mobalytics, or if you just don't know, keep in mind they always have the option to give you the copy code. So you can go right in here, look in the data, right? Do this digging for yourself in real time. I want to stress that again. This is real-time update. So this is as the best look at the meta you're going to get, with being careful with sample sizes. So I can say, all right, this is the variation that I want. I can copy the code, put it right into Runeterra, and you're good to go. So going back, because we're going to go back to our Freljord Noxus version here, right? And of course, keeping in mind whenever it loads and all that stuff, as someone who works with portals for a living, they can be a little slow. But let's go back really quick. The other thing I really like about this is that, let's say you're unfamiliar. Let's say you're going up, you're a newer player, you're going up against Freljord Noxus. You say, okay, well, what cards might they be playing, right? So the really good thing that they do, and I wish they would show more cards, honestly, and I think this is one of the recommendations I gave them, is to expand on this list. But it'll tell you, okay, so I know that they're most likely going to have a Crimson Disciple. And this is a card that, well, I guess at the time of recording this, it's most likely going to get nerfed next patch. But for the sake of discussion, I know this is a card that I have to be mindful of. Maybe you have Thermo Beams that you want to mulligan for a little bit more aggressively, right? Or 3 damage cost spells in general, because if a opponent is using Transfusion, it can get value over time in a much more efficient way. And comboing this with, again, Imperial Demolitionist can be a big ouch, right? As it were. And if you look at this, they actually are included a shockingly large, or significant, I should say, amount of the time. And again, part of this is because the overlap that happens with Noxus, because this is both good for aggro decks and it's also good for leveling up Swain, right? Getting 4 points towards Swain's level up is very good. It helps you in just a very short amount of time make sure that you're getting Swain to be leveled on 5, because quite honestly, it's pretty easy to get Swain leveled on 5 if you have a deck that's doing it. So again, here at the bottom, all the views. And then what I also like too is if you go into best matchups, it'll still show you the same information. Now here's, again, big downside. And I hopefully think this is something I sent to them as well. So by default, it's going to organize by win rate, but it doesn't always have the best look at in terms of what are you most likely to see, right? So you go, oh wow, 82% win rate, but there's only 29 matches. So hopefully this is something in the future that they allow to filter in terms of just making sure that matches pop up, because that's really going to help with what you're going to see. So you do have to do a little bit of work, right? You have to scroll down here. You have to see what else that people are playing. So, all right, look, we got Ionia and PNZ, which is going to be like your Karma, Heimerdinger, Ezreal, Vi decks, right? That kind of cluster together. And this is another area where it doesn't work as well, because if you click on this, right, then you can come down here and see these two combinations. So I think this is one of those interesting points where it's like more of a long-term issue for Runeterra, and I know the Mobalytics team is already working on it. They're doing a great job giving us all this data, but it would be really nice to break out these stats even further by champions at this level if possible. So obviously take that with a grain of salt, but we do know, at least within these region combinations, they're going to have very similar weaknesses in terms of how good or bad they are in certain matchups. So there is quite a bit of overlap here, and we know, for example here, Demacia, more so Bannerman, just absolutely destroys this archetype, has been destroying this archetype since set 1, at least in my own testing, and the team agrees. In the current iteration of the meta, it's also doing very good. So again, same principle. Maybe you are the Karma Ezreal play, and you want to go, okay, well, what matchup should I be worried about? You can click on Demacia, and then you can have a good idea of what's being played. Obviously, this is an area where it looks like the data hasn't updated in time, because there's very few matches here. And I'm actually surprised to see Fiora Garrett instead of the Bannerman deck, right? So again, kind of good with the bad here. And looks like it doesn't let us see the other options. So while I'm on this note, again, I talked about the inclusion rate, or just overall amount that you're going to be seeing it. So what cards should I be worried about seeing? If I know Demacia is a bad matchup, what cards might they be running, right? So you can go over and you can hover over any one of these and really get an idea of, okay, well, Relentless Pursuit is probably the best example of it because this really punishes control decks. And you can, okay, this is something that's included in a lot of the lists, right? So I always recommend sorting by matches because that just increases the probability you're going to be seeing those cards, or should in theory, right, from a meta standpoint. And we can see that it drops off a little bit. Or sorry, there you go. It's number 3 in this list, so it increases. And they generally have 2.3 copies. So generally, you know, if you can find a way to control the early board and have that deny for the rally turn, you can be pretty good about it. So obviously that's just too many answers for the Karma Ezreal decks to generally interact with. And then on top of that, their Demacia units are just generally pretty beefy. So turning your Mystic shots off where they don't trade, you know, 1-for-1 in your opponent's cards can be pretty bad for your overall synergy. So we're going to go back. And again, the thing I do want to mention, always try to filter by matches just so you can kind of expect what's going to be seeing play. The kind of outliers you do have to expect, though, in terms of like, okay, yes, Deep is, what's this, the 5th most played list, but it has a 50% win rate. And this is where it gets more into, let's talk about meta, right? So let's talk about how these interact with one another and what does this always mean. So win rate isn't everything, and that's kind of another disclaimer that I'll add here. However, again, if we kind of think about what else is being played, so it's not just the pure win rate of what's listed here, but then let's go into Deep as an example. And this is also another a good archetype where if you're seeing this combination, you know, 99 times out of 100, unless it's keg control, which is like the only other option, and it looks like some people might actually be playing here, but it's 1,600 matches and it starts to fall off there because these are more deep decks down here. Deep is going to be the most played archetype. So you can just automatically assume, right? Also, when you go into a match, if they have Nautilus, obviously it's a deep deck. If they have Gangplank or Thresh or something else, it's going to be a keg control list. Generally speaking, there is a good amount of card overlap other than just what is their late game answer, right? So it's going to be sea monsters versus stuff like Ladros or just overall Rex, right? Is a very good card. So we'll use here again Bilgewater and Shadow Isles. And it does give you this breakdown once again. So we know, like, okay, they had a 50%, which is not great. That's very low from an overall meta perspective. But what are the bad matchups, right? And immediately we see they lose to the Harrowing deck, which is probably no surprise. So that's a key, you know, tier 1, what we would say, or what you would establish by looking at all of this, right? This is where you start to like write down your notes, compile the data, and start to see how these decks interact with one another. So what I would do is go into worst matchups, see more. In terms of the frequency at which other lists are being played, and just generally thinking about their strategies and what they're trying to do, it's like, okay, well, what else should we do? So we look at this, okay. We have the Noxus Harrowing deck, as I mentioned. 43% win rate, feels pretty terrible. And again, use the matches as guidance here, overall meta. Freljord Noxus, so again, that's going to be the more mixed region with both mid-range and the aggro deck variants, but it's still very low at 43.5%. And then also, Karma Ezreal and Heimerdinger thrown together, 43.4 cents. So we already have a representation of decks that are taking up a large percentage of the meta, and we have a very, very poor win rate. So we then have to think, okay, well, what's a good matchup, right? So that's where we kind of go to our best matchup table, and then we see, well, there's only one match with even over 1,000, and it's going to be what appears is Braum and Nivea. So this is another case where it's really great that you can do this, and I really love how easy it is to click through. We can go to Shadow Isles Freljord, right? So this is going to be the archetype overview, and then we can see the most matches, 4,000 here even, is Braum and Nivea. So by a wide margin, it is most likely going to be a Braum and Nivea deck. And then obviously you can add all these up if you really wanted to and find out that the Elise, the Elise Callista, They Who Endure deck is like, yeah, the 2%. I wish it would show more, right, of the overall play rate, but I wonder what else is down. Oh, this looks like a War Mothers here at the end, right? I'm sure there's like some other fluff stuff in there is what I'm getting at from like an overall play perspective. And I wonder if it'll show me if I go to decks here. right? Here you go. So you can take an overall look at the list, right? Even if we get down to the lower percentages, that's where you start to see it's still Braum and Nivea. It's just different takes on it. So again, very fair to assume that it's going to be Braum and Nivea style decks. So as a deep player, you queue up in the meta. Let's say you really love this list and you're just finding 0 Braum and Nivea players. And that happens, right? The meta does shift quite a bit. You have to understand that Runeterra is very different from any other card game that, you know, in Magic, you're going to have like the one aggro deck, the one mid-range deck, and the one, oversimplifying, and the one control deck, right? That's it. That's the 3 decks that you play for 3 months until the next set drops. We don't have to worry about that. We have live balancing. We have the, I've talked about this quite a bit in other videos, right? The way, the natural pairing, how regions work, it creates a very dynamic meta where as you're changing decks day after day after day, you're creating these kind of like mini metas within each parts of the ladder where you have to really adapt on the fly because those matchups can be so polarizing. And again, some matchups, as we just saw, might be like 45-55. Other ones might be 20-80, right? So they're not, the matchups aren't as polarizing as maybe some people want you to believe. And right, we have the data to show that. But it can still feel bad if I'm the, you know, the deep player and then I play Karma Ezreal for 6 matches. I'm going to be super defeated by the end of it. And that's kind of the other reason why I'm trying to make this video, and it's more just trying to be educational and informational about it in terms of like, what is a meta? How do you use the data, right? That is the opportunity for you to say, okay, well, this is what people are playing tonight. I need to swap decks. What is a bad matchup then for Karma Ezreal? And again, let's just go back in here, right? Let's go back to our matchup for, I guess I could just click here for Demacia. We'll just shortcut this, right? So we know Demacia has a good matchup. We'll just take, all these are terrible. Perfect. No surprise. It's a Bannerman type of deck that's been good in the past, right? Say, okay, I'm seeing a lot of Karma Ezreal. Let's go. Let's do copy the code. I got my deck list, put it right into the game. Good to go. Start winning like 10 matches in a row, right? Maybe a little bit of an extreme scenario there, but still good nonetheless. So that is like the overall archetype view. Now, there is some other neat things that you could be doing with this, right? There is the filtering capabilities where if you say, okay, I really want to play a Freljord list. Let's say if you're like me and you've just had the most success with Freljord decks and you can't get away from them, I might say, hey, I'm going to just continue on with Freljord, right? That seems like a natural thing to do. So here you can see all the different variations with Freljord that are doing, you know, from obviously the best to the worst, as it were, right? Like mono at 0.1%, 116 matches. Oof. You can see here all the way at the bottom, there is a mono Freljord list somebody tried to queue up with and just didn't have much success with it. And then some other options down here, right? So here's the Poro deck. Here is what looks like another, I'm assuming there's another variation of Poros because I saw the Radiant Guardian and there's a Braum in there. Just more of like a controlling match, right? So you can then click into any one of these, and I'm going to pick a different one just because. So I'll do Bilgewater and Freljord, and then we can say, okay, well, here's the different types of lists that people are playing, and then again, understanding what the matchups are going to be like, because that is a very important part going into this and card games in general. You want to know what's a good matchup versus bad matchup and what cards to be aware of, right? And how good or bad some of those might be. So here's the case of the Freljord Bilgewater list, or matchups, I should say, table, and the various region combinations kind of across them. And then again, you can go into the different card breakdown, and then at the very end, you can go into decks. So again, I hope this has been, and I think that's everything that I wanted to cover. I'm trying to do this like right before streaming just to try to get the video out there. So hopefully this can help guide the discussion towards next week, right? When the big patch happens, which is on Thursday, if I remember correctly, give their new schedule, right? So by Friday or Saturday, we should have enough data to then come back in here and say, okay, wow, this one aggro deck is doing really good, right? Like, let me see what people are playing. What does it look like? And then again, you can either copy it or understand what are good and bad matchups for it. So this is something that's really helpful if you're willing to put in the time, right? If you're interested in the data side of it and understanding what are good matchups, what are my percentages, you know, what other things should I be looking for, or just kind of like, hey, what are people playing right now, right? Even so, Fury of the North, most played card right now at 3,800 matches. Kind of surprising that Fury, I guess it shouldn't, because this is the most played region right now. Very interesting to see that Harrowing, which again goes with the Noxus deck, but I was kind of surprised here not to see Will of Ionia more. Not far behind it, but pretty close. So it's just a way to familiarize yourself with it. And then again, once this actually updates, keep in mind, try to stay. It's always going to be relative to how many games are played, right? So this is like a moving target. If there's, and this is not meant to be like a rule of thumb or anything. I'm just trying to use an example, right? So if there's only 100,000 games played, let's go for example, don't use anything under 1,000, right? Some of these matches are going to roll up where even here you can notice, right? So these, other than number 2 here, the rest of these are all the same deck or variations on it, right? They're very, very close. So take into consideration, all these are really meant to be combined. And then if we click on more, okay, this one doesn't have any threshold behind it. Generally, it'll load. Oh, there it goes. It actually worked. It'll load all the other variations here towards the bottom, right? But then you're going down to 50, 49, 48, right? The matches really start to fall off at some point where it's just not worth investing in those. So please try to keep in mind, what you might want to be looking for. Obviously, like less than 1%, I probably wouldn't consider it unless it's a completely new deck archetype. And that's probably a good transition, right? So one thing I think that gets overlooked, and again, this is one of those things where I have to kind of shoot my foot in the way of saying it because I'm going to do something I said don't do earlier. Let's filter by win rate. And let's look at this from like an overall. And why is it saying 81% now? All right, hold on. Let's go back and fix this. So let's go to, I was in decks, not regions. That's why, right? So let's go to champions and let's sort this. Let's sort this by matches, excuse me. And let's kind of scroll down, right? So this is where you'll start to see, okay, what are people playing in terms of champion focus, right? Because that's kind of like where you really start to break down, let's say, for example, Noxus Shadow Isles, right? Sorry, that's a bad example. We should use Karma Ezreal, and Heimerdinger, right? So PNZ and Ionia. This is where you see Karma Ezreal and also Heimerdinger and Vi. And if you're looking at that archetype or the region view, like I just mentioned, which is going to be this tab right here, you're going to see a kind of different subset of data. But if you go by champions, right, it's going to force you to be locked into this one particular look of the data. So what I like to do, just from either creating content or talk about like what's up and coming, let's then look for decks that are going to have a generally like decent, let's say like 53-ish% win ratio, or better, and still have like a good amount of sample size, right? And by sample size, again, I mean matches. I'm just using the more data-driven side of the term. So actually, right, so this is a good example because I can guarantee you nobody's been talking about Yasuo Katarina. And again, kind of using that same like barrier. So like 1% and less generally don't want to look at, but this one's interesting, right? So we have a completely new deck. No one's been talking about it. Has a 54% win ratio, has a decent amount of matches, right? So this isn't just one person, and if it is, it's just insane. It's most likely not just one person, jamming out all these games, and then we can go a step further and go, okay, which one of these do we want to be looking at? Again, keeping in mind, where do the matches break out? This is where it starts to, you have to go into each one of these and kind of see what the common themes are. But again, for the sake of trying to make this video not an hour long like I could, let's just go with the first example, right? Most matches, and boom, we have a Yasuo Katarina deck. I would call this like a meta sleeper right now, just because, again, it has a decent amount of matches and a better, it has a better win rate than some archetypes that are going out on meta lists right now in tier 3 deep decks. So this could be very, very well be something. And again, I'm actually kind of really happy to see, maybe I'm going to play this on stream tonight now. I'm super happy to see this because now it's something else that I can dig into. I can kind of look over these card selections, see what the overlap is, and see what's good, see what's bad. So let's say you get this far, and now that, sorry, I'm kind of like, I'm doing this on the fly, so this is like a real-time discovery thing for me. Let's go. Okay, Yasuo Katarina. Noxus and Ionia is typically not a popular pairing unless it's a Yasuo deck, right? Like in archetype or set 1, that was the archetype because you have these stun cards of Noxus that just play well into this. So then we're going to go back. We're going to go to our meta stats. We're going to click on regions. We're going to do Ionia and Noxus, or I guess we can just go by Ionia here, right? So this will only let you do one at a time, but you can toggle between these two if you really wanted to. And it looks like they're both going to pop up two and number 3 respectively. And we have 6,000 matches. So let's click into this and see what else people are playing. Oh, right, the Noxus burn deck that fell off this past week, actually. So that still has some inflated numbers. But if we kind of look at what else is going on, okay, so Swain Yasuo, and then down here towards the bottom, if we break out just the Yasuo and Katarina, we have some other variations of it, right? So we're not seeing that same win rate percent one, but there is some other things. Zed and Shen, hello? Only 148 matches. I don't feel that bad about that one. But if we were on to, let's look at the Swain one. This is where you can start to compare, right? So maybe you're opening up multiple tabs. Maybe you just really want to try to build a new list. Maybe you just really like Yasuo, right? So you could also then filter by Yasuo. But then you have another variation. So yes, it's still going to have the stun cards, right? I'm pretty sure Blade Twirler was in both. Crimson was most likely in both because it's really good right now, but hopefully drops out next week. With the exception of Swain List, are hopefully still playing it. Sentry, it stuns, helps you level up Yasuo. It's a great tempo swing card to save you against like a Basilisk Rider. Shadow Assassin, best Ionia card. Best Ionia unit overall, right? Not much to be said there. And then Reckoner, kind of like his more signature card in sense of like, what does every Yasuo deck run, right? It's going to be Reckoner, and then most often the time it's going to be Legion General as well, just because it gets super big. And then in this case, we can see they have a bunch more control cards and a lot of damage effects here. The Might's super interesting. Obviously, the Might is a 1-up for Blade Twirler. Flock just helping Swain level up. So let's say that's not enough data. Let's say you want to see even more on this deck or this archetype, right? Go back to, I keep clicking on the tier list instead. Let's go to Champions. Let's go to Ionia. And we can even filter this out by Yasuo, right? And here again, we can see these various lists. So this is something that I'm pretty sure I lost a bet because I made a joke about Yasuo and Swain at the start of the set 2, and joke's on me. Actually, I think it's just really well positioned in this meta, but in general, I lost a bet, so I have to go figure out who I owe what to. But again, here's another way. Okay, even mono Yasuo, which is not working out, but again, going back, you can then decide, do I want Katarina? Do I want Swain? And then you can kind of compare the list, right? So we have House Spider in this one. There's a Legion General that I mentioned, and then Yone, who has the stun ability, which was a really, really strong card early on. So yes, a little bit longer of a video, but I hope that kind of guided the discussion from, you know, what is good versus bad data. How do we determine what's meta and what decks counter other ones? And then lastly, what sleeper decks might be listed. And again, if you missed it up front, I have to say it now just because I feel obligated as somebody who works with data for a living. This is inherently a biased sample because it's only available of people who are using the deck tracker. However, I think this is a good spot to then say, okay, what other decks are popping up? What am I excited to see? And this is a quite legitimate opportunity for people to come in here and decide, okay, well, let's try to find a new list, right? Let's look at all the matches and then decide, and it filtered twice. Let's look at some of these other ones that might have, you know, around 1,000 and have a decent win rate percentage. And that's where Karma's coming in, right? So there are what people would consider tier 1 deck list in this spot. But again, people are not, looking at them consistently. And there's PNZ Burn, sadly, coming back up. Again, the downside or caveat that I'll add to this is that it is a 2-month rolling. And what I mean by that is that for 2 months, they just continually add data until the next patch where it resets. So this is, or I guess every patch. It says patch 1.5 here, so I'm assuming that they reset it, but I don't know at the time of recording this if they did prior to this. But I am assuming that they did. So this is something that you have to be active in, but it can be extremely, extremely rewarding. And I hopefully did a decent job at showing both the pros and cons that sites like Mobalytics has. Now, again, there's other sites out there, other deck trackers you could freely use for information. But again, I am a Mobalytics partner. And again, no means ad sponsored or anything like that. It's what I use, and it's what I would use from like a data analysis. And from a Team Leviathan gaming standpoint, this is what helps us drive some of those discussions or some of those decisions, right? So it's not just what we're seeing in the ladder, how the decks go up against one another, if we think that they have good play out chances or outplay chances, I should say, like other matchups, like Deep, for example, right? Just bottom of the barrel. It's an awful, awful, awful list right now. It's just not well meta positioned. So with that, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it was at least educational, informational, that you don't have to watch another meta video if you don't want to, because all this information is freely available. This is nothing that, you know, you do need to have a little bit of understanding of what the cards do and like meta knowledge for that perspective. But anyone with a, you know, I would say even an average analytical capability can come in here, dig into the data, find some unique nuggets of information, and not have to wait until the next meta video that, you know, myself included, that myself or anybody else does, because this information is updated. It is close to real time as we're going to get. So with that, I'm out of here. I have to go actually sit with the Fua. So thank you so much for watching the video. If you liked it, if you want to see more meta breakdown discussions like this and more trend style of things, definitely make sure to drop a like and subscribe. That helps me out a ton. And then let me know if you want to see any of these kind of broken out further, like doing a deck spotlight on Yasuo Katarina, for example, right? That's something I would more than happy to dig into over time. But with that, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.